From the heart of preLights, the preprint highlighting service run by early career researchers and supported by the Company of Biologists, this is spotLights.
Data is your friend, right? Data is not scary. Data about understanding how science progresses can actually help us make more progress.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Townson, and I'm one of the prelighters. I'm also a postdoctoral research scientist at the University of Oslo. Recently, I identified a couple of preprints that have come from the United States on research funding and publication outputs I was particularly interested in and wrote a prelight on. I was very happy that one of the authors of those preprints, Kristine Willis, was able to join me to record this Spotlight episode.
Hi, this is Kris Willis. I'm very happy to be here with you guys, and thank you for inviting me.
So, Kris, maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself and what you've been doing.
Sure. So my background is as a systems biologist. I'm also a former NIH-funded investigator, a former NIH program director, and currently the founder of the Woodley Clark Institute, which is an independent research organization focused on understanding how scientific progress occurs, how funding systems shape discovery, and how we can best distribute funding in order to support breakthrough research.
You just founded this institute recently, or?
Yes.
It's brand new.
And we're brand new. I'm having a lot of fun. We're about 3 months in. So it's very busy, very exciting, very, very important work, I think.
Yeah. Why did you found the institute? What pushed you down this route from being a systems biologist to down here?
I was at, Georgetown prior to joining NIH, and it's like hard to avoid the conversation around policy, right? And thinking about how we manage things and how we manage systems. And it was just a very natural transition for me from there to NIH. And when I got to NIH, my background, in big data, specifically, I come from a transcriptomics, genomics background, really profoundly influenced how I viewed the grant making process, right? So to me, when I'm looking at what we are doing, I can see that we're collecting all of this information in order to use it, to administer a single grant. But then I thought, okay, well, what does it look like if we take all of this information and we look at it at a systems level? What does that tell us about how we are accomplishing our mission and how we're achieving our goals as an agency?
So then you're in this role, and I guess these preprints have come out from your work in this role you had at the NIH?
Right. So I was collaborating there with other people at the NIH, and these preprints are the result of that collaboration.
So maybe you could sort of briefly describe some of the research you shared in it and any particular highlights from the research as well.
We were really excited. I was really excited to see you make the connection between the two because we think that they're definitely connected. The first preprint is looking at trends in NIH funding. And it was really motivated by a desire to understand what, if any, effect our administrative choices are having on downstream research directions. So when we do things at the agency, like what impact is that having downstream on the actual science that gets produced? And what we found was that over time, the funding opportunities that NIH puts out, as well as the grant applications that we receive back, and also the publications that were generated by the applications that were ultimately awarded, all became more clinically and translationally oriented. The other preprint is about predicting transformative breakthroughs in biomedical research. And this was really started by an absolutely audacious question that I was really excited about. I think we were all excited about, which is how do we shorten the time between a discovery and its impact? And for all of us, the pain point that came to mind was the time that we know is well established, the lag that can occur between when a discovery is made and when it gets recognized by the scientific community. We thought, well, if we can recognize the discovery earlier, maybe we can compress that process and get the therapeutics and the treatments out faster. And in fact, we can. We show in the preprint that we can identify future transformative discoveries. We can predict that the publications that actually describe the discovery are going to be published on average 5 years before those papers actually appear, up to 12 years before the actual discovery is made, and up to 30 years before it's recognized by a major prize. And we think that it's a really important advance in our understanding of how scientific progress is recognized and supported and understood.
The time frame then, because all the preprints focused on pre-2017. Post-2017, we had COVID, where science accelerated massively.
Right.
Does that break the kind of what you see?
I don't think that that is going to break it. What we're capturing with the method, and I think this is important to note, is that what we're looking at is the patterns of communication between practicing scientists. And that's what's really identifying the signals, right? So, and I think that's an important point. This is not, an LLM-based agentic natural language processing approach. This is a leveraging of the communication that occurs between practicing scientists when you publish and when you are co-cited with somebody else. I don't have any reason to believe that scientists communicated differently or less after 2017, right?
Yeah.
So we fully expect that this is going to extend with accuracy to future years.
Do you think that preprints, we might see the same patterns, but do you think you'll see them in a condensed period of time thanks to preprints? Or are people still going to be relying more on the published version versus the preprint?
I think that that's a very interesting and important direction for future research. I'm definitely interested in incorporating preprints into the co-citation network and to see if that can give us an even more advanced warning of future discoveries. I think it's going to be technically challenging because so many preprints wind up as peer-reviewed papers in biomedical science especially. And so in order to incorporate the preprints into the co-citation network, you have to resolve into a single entity, right? So that means you have to combine the citations, you have to combine the paper, only count it once, and it's important to disambiguate that accurately. But I think you put your finger on exactly why it's so important to do that in order to capture that early buzz about that early stage of communication about a particular piece of work. Yeah.
So it feels like physics, where preprints have been around for much longer. Would this co-citation network apply more easily on their preprints, where maybe they don't always convert to peer review?
I don't think it will apply easier or less easy. I think it will work just as well. And you know what? I looked into this recently. I don't even think that there's particularly great data on the rate of conversion. Of course, it depends on field. It also depends on the time frame. Like if you're asking, is it published in the next 6 months or is it published in the next 3 years, right? Like, so there's a lot of still even gray area about the rate of conversion.
Okay, so digging at the two actual preprints you had then, I think if we start with the co-citation network, from the point of view of an early career researcher who wants some money in the future, can I use the co-citation network to predict what I should research and then cite this in my grant applications and say, this is going to be the next big breakthrough, so give me the money?
Well, that would depend right now on how the community views that. I don't think I can answer that for the community. I do think that this kind of approach has the potential to help people manage the literature, right? Because I think that one thing that has definitely happened that's incontrovertible is that the number of papers that are published each year has just grown exponentially. And it would be helpful to have some guidance to find things that are the most relevant to you. And we're seeing a lot of effort in that space right now with, of course, agentic AI based in LLM. I don't want to be overly negative about that approach. I think it has some interesting positives, but it also has some negatives. The problem with LLMs for discovery is that the space is too sparse, right? We don't have enough information where there's too many unknowns about biology and chemistry. And so it's possible that this kind of approach may have the potential to inform scientists about, things that are relevant to them that they maybe want to think about when they're designing their experiments or deciding what direction to pursue. At the same time, I think we want to be careful that we don't all lump into the same 6 fields, right?
Yeah.
Because one open research question is, how does a field get born in the first place, right? So we can tell you, oh yeah, this field that has already cohered, we're going to predict that it is likely to produce a future breakthrough. But what we don't know enough about is how did that field cohere in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And we don't want to undercut that very important process by focusing exclusively on the things that are already, at that stage where they're positioned to make a huge advance.
I was wondering, is this why you stopped at 2017, or was it just because you only had data up to 2017?
I think no, no, it was just a convenience, right? So
Yeah, okay.
yeah, it is an analytical convenience. There's definitely no reason why this wouldn't be equally applicable up to, certainly 2024, right? Like, I mean, you do have to have some time in order
Yeah.
for the co-citation networks to stabilize. And that is one thing that incorporating preprints could potentially shorten that and make it a little bit faster.
Can the co-citation networks predict when two areas will come together? Or can it predict that this area is getting so big now that it's going to split into more than one thing soon?
That would also be a really fascinating future research direction. It's something that I've always been fascinated by, is that issue of the convergence and divergence, right? Which
Yeah.
appears to be statistically more likely in the vicinity of a breakthrough, right? Which is, I think, very intuitive to us as as practicing scientists. And so, studying that convergence and divergence, I think is a really interesting future research direction.
I was first asked from the point of view of somebody applying for funding, but from the point of view of somebody giving these co-citation networks and say, this person is applying for funding in an area that is likely to produce a breakthrough, so we're more likely to give them money. But do you think funding agencies would behave in that way, or do you think they will try and ignore this kind of thing?
But I do think it's really important to maintain a balanced portfolio.
Yeah.
Right. And as a funder, as a research agency. And I think that what this can do is to give decision makers more data, not necessarily that they should, take their brains out and replace them with the computer, right? I would argue against that very strongly. But we all have sort of inherent biases as humans, right? And one of them, I think, is that I do, we tend to think that the area that we've spent our life on is, of course, it's the most important thing ever. And in order to have a subject matter expert reviewing your proposal, you're going to have somebody who also has that same perspective often. And so to have some outside data to act as a good check on that, because I think that as scientists, that's what we should always be doing, is testing our assumptions, right? And the easiest person to fool is yourself.
Yeah.
And so maybe just to have some data in hand so that you can say, okay, well, this is my impression of this. What does the data say about it?
So I guess your sort of aspiration for it would be that it might open up people to think alternatively to how they actually think at the time, rather than to use it as a confirmation bias, use it as more of a challenge to their way of thinking, to open up new avenues for them to go down instead.
Absolutely. That's very well put. Yes.
The other preprint then, sort of at the front end with the allocation of the funding, showed this sort of trend towards funding clinical research over time. Do you think that will continue?
There's no way to know.
Could it be a question for a sociologist to put in the context of what society is doing versus the change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a complicated question. And I think that, again, we need more data and more study and more funding of what we're actually doing. What's the actual effect? We know what the intent is when we, design a program, but what is the actual effect of the program? And more data and more study and more information about, what is the right balance, right? Because we have no idea, right? I think it's broadly accepted that both fundamental and applied research is essential to making advances, but nobody knows how much of each one. What's the optimum ratio there? Nobody knows.
Is it possible to reframe what the impact is rather than being the award to the scientists? It would be the impact to the society.
Right. So I think, you put your finger on the most important point of connection between the two preprints. One is that the preprint on trends in funding shows this really gradual shift towards clinical and translational research at, all levels and of the process. And then the predictions and breakthroughs shows that in this later period that we analyzed, the breakthroughs are also more clinical and translational, which is exactly kind of what you would expect, right? Like if all of your science is more clinically and translationally oriented, it's maybe not surprising that your breakthroughs are also more clinically and translationally oriented. I think that it is pretty straightforward, actually, to connect those signals to a drug or a therapy. And in fact, we talk about some of this, right? Like, so in that later period, 2014, 2017 period that we analyzed in the preprint, the optical coherence tomography has already won a Lasker Award. So then, of course, that has a lot of clinical significance. It's a clinical technique. But there are other things, right? Like, so DEXA scanning in order to document fragility is one of the later breakthroughs. One of the ones that I'm particularly fascinated by is this brand new class of antibiotics that targets lipid metabolism in antibiotic-resistant bacteria like Acinetobacter. So you can definitely connect the signal of a breakthrough directly to a drug or a device or a therapeutic application. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a prize at all.
And you also, I think, mentioned HIV in the preprints.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Thanks for asking that question. Because in the earlier period that we looked at, so we looked at two time periods for the signals of breakthroughs, 1994 to 1997, where we would expect that, most of those have already been recognized, and a later time period, 2014 to 2017, where we would expect most of those have not yet been recognized, but we're more making predictions. So if you look at the earlier time period, one of the signals of a breakthrough is in quality of life care for HIV patients, right? And that is not the kind of thing that tends to win a big fancy Nobel Prize, right? Which I think, highlights both the fact that the method is effective at identifying things that are not traditionally considered prize worthy. And I think that's important, but also that the prizes themselves are not a perfect representation of what constitutes a breakthrough.
Could the model be used as a way of deciding what should get given a prize as well? For the HIV thing, do you think it's predicted that, this was worthy of more recognition than it's got, and so it should be given something? Or
I think what the most important thing to me is realizing how much of what we consider significant is in our perspective.
Yeah, maybe there are other things that don't come through in the model where for the people who are impacted, it's a huge deal, but it just wasn't so important on the co-citation network or something. The scientists weren't communicating about it as much as the community that was impacted by it are communicating about it.
Right. And I think, that's a really important point. And I think we need to be humble about the fact that we aren't saying that we, are perfect and we know everything, certainly not. But I think one of the value adds of our particular model is that it uses the relative citation ratio instead of raw citations to measure influence. And I think that's a critically important thing because precisely of what you said, right? When you talk about raw citations and you talk about a small field, raw citations are always going to disadvantage that, right? And I have given the example many times of, like, if you're the parent of a kid with a rare pediatric disorder, the fact that, there are only 2 labs citing that work does not make it less significant, but it does mean that there are less total citations accrued, right? Whereas if you normalize to the size of the field, now you really appreciate that work, right? Because you seem relative to the other people in the field, this is really important. So I think it's really important to have that normalized measure of influence when you're looking at co-citation networks and not just like raw, non-normalized to field. Yeah.
I think I hadn't fully appreciated the normalization there. That just kind of shakes the question.
I don't want to say that we've completely eliminated it, but we're certainly, doing the best we can to adjust for the fact that the fields are going to have different sizes,
As well as the stuff that didn't make it in, what's direction you would want to take the research in the future? We had a couple of things come up, but if you had to pick one next direction you want to go in with the research.
Yeah, I don't know if I can pick a single direction.
The top 3?
Yeah, there's so much work to do here, and I really do hope that we get some partners who are interested in doing it with us. I think, for me personally, I think, I will pick two. One, because it's just so obvious, which is the incorporation of preprints, right? I think that's going to be so important to do. And then for me personally, the thing that I find the most fascinating is this issue of convergence and divergence and birth and death, right? Like,
Yeah.
what does that life cycle look like? How do you get to the point of being a coherent topic, and at what point do you tail off? There are some areas where, it's just obvious. Okay, look, this is what needs to happen, and we just need to grind it out, right? Like,
Yeah.
you just need to follow the obvious track along and get there, right? That definitely happens, right? And so what categories of discovery is that even true for, right? Like, when is that true, and when do you actually need a serendipitous convergence or divergence, and how can we stimulate more of those? Yeah, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of fascinating questions to ask.
I think you touched on it at the beginning. This is kind of what you want to continue with the Woodley Park Institute.
Yeah. So Woodley Park really has two missions. One is to continue to do this work, right?
Yeah.
To inform policymakers. And the other is to partner with nonprofits to help them understand how to make the best use of their scarce, let's be honest, scarce research funding in order to have it have the highest possible impact. And, ultimately, I hope in the long term that we'll have the support to do some grant making of our own once the organization grows to be able to handle that in terms of personnel.
Thank you to Kris for joining me for the spotlight. And for anybody who's interested in what we talked about, there is a preLight post on the preLights website, and you can also find the two preprints linked there as well.
Thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me. This was a great conversation.